Well, I suppose the most important lesson about the steal of the presidency in 1876 is to remember that history can repeat itself. We look at what happened on January 6th, an attempted insurrection led by the president. That was, extraordinary, and to us, it's like unimaginable. But, look at our history, it's not inconceivable. We have a unique situation historically today. We have a president leading the charge for election theft, and is the most dangerous person in this whole political environment for the possibility of some different form of what happened in 2020 occurring in the next couple of months in 2026. So that lesson, we got to just remember this history. You have to be 100% prepared for it if it happens, and you have to be 100% engaged to try to make it not happen.
Welcome to episode 301 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united in mass nonviolent resistance in the streets and throughout society to drive the Trump fascist regime from power. This week, we're sharing an interview with constitutional litigator David F. Walbert. He is the author of the soon-to-be-published book, Stealing Elections, American Style. Before we begin, if you appreciate the Refuse Fascism podcast, help us reach more people. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Share this episode and consider becoming a paid Substack subscriber or joining our Patreon community. Every bit of support helps us keep going, keep growing, and keep bringing the demand that the Trump fascist regime must go now to society as a whole. So be sure to check the links in the show notes to join our Substack or Patreon communities and to get that Refuse Fascism merch. Now, we gotta start this episode by stating a plain but essential truth. Relying on the upcoming midterm elections to contain or defeat fascism is not only misguided, but it's outright dangerous. Last Tuesday, Trump was asked on air whether he might declare a national emergency to impose new restrictions on the November midterms without Congress. His answer, quote, "Stranger things have happened. I'll leave it at that," end quote, spoken like a mafia don. For months, Trump has demanded passage of the Save America Act, requiring proof of citizenship to register, photo ID to vote, and imposing new restrictions on mail-in voting. They don't have the votes in the Senate, so now the President of the United States is publicly leaving open the possibility of invoking a national emergency to interfere in an election his party fears losing. This comes after Trump used a nationally televised address last month to tell the country that its elections are compromised. It comes as his regime pushes voter suppression and systematically undermines confidence in any election result that does not deliver what Trump wants. They are telling you what they are preparing to do, but here's the thing. They aren't just preparing. They've already started. And it might be more accurate to say they never stopped. For example, for the first time since the Civil War, this year, former Confederate states have been empowered to remap their congressional districts without federal oversight. In a shock to no one paying attention, they did exactly what that oversight had existed to prevent, systematically disenfranchising Black people and people in urban areas in order to tighten the grip of white supremacy. We've already seen how quickly the extraordinary can be imposed and then absorbed into everyday life. This past week marked 1 year since Trump sent armed troops into Washington, D.C. under the fabricated pretext of a quote-unquote crime emergency. 1 year later, soldiers are part of the landscape on streets, in metro stations, around monuments, at farmers markets. Think about that. Armed troops deployed among the civilian population of the nation's capital. A year later, what should still shock the conscience has become part of everyday life. This is the direction and momentum of fascism. What once would have caused alarm becomes background noise. What was unthinkable becomes Tuesday. And now we learn about something called Operation Puppet Master. Newly released DHS records reveal federal agents infiltrating organizing meetings in New York and Minneapolis, surveilling private signal chats, recording demonstrations, tracking license plates, and obtaining financial records, all in pursuit of what the government called a quote-unquote network of conspirators. Who were they looking at? Activists, labor unions, the AFL-CIO, SEIU, teachers, public employees, the DSA, showing up for racial justice, Surge. This follows Trump's designation of quote-unquote Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization and NSPM 7, the directive mobilizing the machinery of the federal government against political opposition and even against people associated with disfavored political beliefs. For more on that, see the show notes. This is not some abstract warning about what Trump might do someday. The machinery is being built now, and it's being used now. Surveillance on a whole new scale, political prosecutions on a whole new scale, troops in the streets, dissent recast as terrorism, and now threats to use emergency power against the elections themselves. Meanwhile, Trump is deeply unpopular. And what conclusion are millions of decent people being encouraged to draw from that? Great, we can beat him in November. No, Trump's unpopularity should be fuel for millions of people who refuse to live in a fascist America to pour into the streets and the public squares and demand that this regime nonviolently be driven from power. Instead, people are being told to wait for an election the regime itself is openly threatening to interfere with. That is deadly quicksand. 17 months ago, Refuse Fascism warned in our call to conscience. Waiting for the next election will be too late. We cannot rely on the Democratic Party's leadership, who complacently rely on the very norms and processes that the Trump regime shreds by the hour. And look at the trajectory since then. What happens when a fascist regime controls the executive branch, commands the military and federal law enforcement, surveils its political opponents, criminalizes dissent, attacks the legitimacy of elections, and then decides it will not accept an outcome that threatens its grip on power? Waiting for November is not a strategy for stopping fascism. And every day spent adapting to this, every new outrage absorbed, every new line crossed and normalized makes what comes next, whatever it is, easier. This is fascism, and we can never say it often enough. The Trump fascist regime must go now. Turning to today's interview, if somehow beyond all this contemporary evidence, you still believe that this kind of thing just couldn't happen here, the conversation I had with David F. Walbert, the author of Stealing Elections, American Style, should help dispel that. In his forthcoming book, he details how stolen elections have been at the heart of key turning points in American history, from the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s to the initiation of the open-ended war on the world, began in the early 2000s and more. This election meddling is not just something that opportunist politicians do from time to time. For more than 150 years, white supremacists have refused to accept the expansion of the vote beyond white men. In 1876, that meant stealing the election for the Democrats. In 2000, that meant stealing it for the Republicans. But every time, it has meant installing the person who won the white male vote. This is the legacy that Trump is fulfilling. Millions are staking everything on the midterms. But the Trump regime, as I said before, holds federal power, is suppressing the vote, and moving to subvert the elections. They are doing so openly and relentlessly. Let's also be clear that even a Democratic Congress leaves Trump in power. The fascists tried to overturn the 2020 election and unleash deadly violence when they lost. This time, they purged those who might stand in their way, defied Congress repeatedly, bent the machinery of the federal government to their will, and have the Supreme Court at their back. This is a rolling coup. They are moving on every front to cement fascist rule and shut down the means to remove them. Some say we have to be prepared to get in the streets to demand fair elections as a last-ditch effort. We absolutely do need to prepare people to get in the streets, but we cannot just wait until that happens and try to switch gears in the moment, especially if that moment becomes a long, drawn-out legal and legislative circus. Before the 2020 election, Trump was already undermining the integrity of that election. During the election count, Trump mobilized his base to intimidate vote counters, and then he openly organized an insurrection, publicly advertising the place, the date, the time. And what did the decent people of the country do in that moment? As one of the few people in the streets, calling others in the streets, I'll tell you, Not much of anything. At every point, the electoral opposition to Trump told us to wait, told us to relax. Months later, the New York Times came out with an extensive piece on how and why the Democratic Party actively derailed any public opposition to Trump's moves during that period. And they were proud of that. If we want people to actually be prepared, we need them to understand the situation now and to raise the only demand that meets the situation now. And that demand is Trump must go now. Is there anything else we can do? Well, if we take off our American exceptionalism tinted glasses, we can see that all over the world and throughout history, people have risen up in sustained disruptive mass action to create political crises through which despised rulers can be, and have been, removed from power. Could there be lessons from that vast history for us, even if we live in the supposed greatest of all countries? It is imperative that through the course of this election, we defend people's right to vote, even as we cannot rely on voting to resolve this. We have to be preparing now for the moment when millions are ready to move and be ready to lead that fury somewhere positive, not into just a one-day protest, not into another collective scream into the ether, not back into the very norms and processes that the fascists are shredding by the hour, but into a sustained, determined, nonviolent movement that does not stop until this regime is driven from power. Millions of people who disagree about all kinds of things, but who come together around the one demand that rises above everything else in this moment, that the fascist Trump regime must go now. But that force won't spring into existence on its own. It has to be built now, and you are needed to be part of building it. So after listening to today's episode, if you haven't already, join refusefascism.org and start spreading that demand now and contributing to this effort today. With that, here is my conversation with David. We are now less than 3 months from the 2026 midterm elections, and millions of people are being told that the way to stop the Trump fascist regime is simple: to vote. However, Trump has openly demanded new congressional maps designed to guarantee more Republican seats. His administration has turned the power of the federal government against voting rights, installed election deniers in positions connected to election integrity, and continued to spread the lie that elections Trump doesn't like are fraudulent. And we already know what Trump was willing to do when we lost an election. In 2020, he tried to overturn the results, pressure state officials to change vote totals, substitute fake electors, weaponize the Justice Department, and ultimately unleashed a violent mob on January 6th. So what happens when the man who did all of that is back in power with far fewer restraints and much more control over the machinery of government? My guest today is David F. Walbert. David has litigated dozens of election cases, including landmark cases before the Supreme Court. He's taught constitutional law, testified before Congress on voting legislation, and most recently authored Stealing Elections, American Style, which is published by Bloomsbury and forthcoming September 3rd. His book traces a long and ugly history of stolen and manipulated elections in this country, from outright fraud to voter suppression, gerrymandering, partisan courts, and laws that can determine who wins before Election Day ever arrives. And his warning for this moment is urgent. For the first time in American history, the federal government itself is leading the attack on voting rights and fair elections. David, welcome to the Refuse Fascism podcast. Thank you for joining.
Well, Samantha, thank you.
So I wanted to start with where your book begins, with the stolen election of 1876. The crisis wasn't simply that people cheated. Institutions ultimately gave legitimacy to an outcome that didn't reflect the voters' choice. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through a little bit, what are the lessons that you want us to take away from the 1876 story, and what that has to do with institutional breakdown or institutions functioning in ways that can legitimize election theft?
Well, I suppose the most important lesson about the steal of the election, steal of the presidency in 1876 is to remember that history can repeat itself in a different sort of format. And we look at things that in history that are outrageous, and it's sort of when we're children, we grow up and think, well, that's history. That's not the present. And you've got to be sensitive. That was only 150 years ago. which, of course, in the United States, that's a long time, and the rest of the world, that's a short time. But things like that, you can never forget their significance in terms of potential repeat in a different format, maybe. An interesting thing about the 1876 election certainly was some cheating on the front end. Front end meaning who gets to put the ballots in the box, what ballots are in there, and so on, which was, not atypical at all for the 1800s. You didn't have secret ballots back then, for example. That didn't come in until late 1800s and so on. And that's true in, I think Australia was the first country. It's called the Australian ballot, in fact, first one that had secret ballots. So one of the things that is kind of, I thought was dramatic in Florida, there were 3 states involved in the steal in 1876. And Florida was one of those 3. Louisiana was the most stunning one of the examples in terms of extraordinary fraud. But in one of the railroads was trying to make his employees vote for the Democratic candidate in that case. So he handed out ballots to all of them, which back in those days, you didn't go behind a little curtain in privacy and mark the ballot. You physically brought a ballot with that person, your candidates on there, and put it in the box. So everybody knew who you were voting for. And this guy handed out ballots to all his employees in advance, and they were all numbered. So he would know at the end of the day, not did you vote, because he'd have a tracking of the numbers and make sure, of course, the ballot is for that candidate. So it was a lot of ugly stuff on the front end that was pretty characteristic of the time. But on the back end, the count, really that one was stolen at the count. And that's a phrase that I wasn't really used to in dozens and dozens of election cases. Tilden, who had the election stolen from him, Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, when he asked later, he made this famous comment. He said that somebody asked him to sum up what happened to the whole election. He said, well, real simply, the men who won the election for president and vice president were counted out, and 2 men who lost were counted in. And just the example that one of the Louisiana canvassing board, which had the responsibility for bringing all the county votes together, parish votes in Louisiana, and promulgating the official result, one of the members on that canvassing board famously said before they did the count, says, well, they may have us in the vote, but we've got them in the count. And in Louisiana, it turned an 8,000 vote Tilden win into a 3,500 vote Tilden loss. And hence and that damn near triggered another civil war. There was actually I think it was the governor of Indiana, telegrammed the head of the Democratic Party in Louisiana and said, we got 100,000 men armed here. We'll be there if you want. Give us a call. So it was, all those things are important. We look at what happened on January 6th, an attempted insurrection by, thousands of people led by the president. And that was, extraordinary. And to us, it's like unimaginable. And it was unimaginable. But you look at our history, it's not inconceivable. And I think those are the things that when we look at this year, and as you mentioned, Sam, the person in the White House today, we have a unique situation historically today. We have a president leading the charge for election theft. Now, that's a new one. We've never had that before. We have a president going around demanding gerrymandering in all the different states. That's never happened before. As you know from American history, presidents do get involved in Senate and local elections to a certain extent, but it's not pervasive because usually it's considered to be a backlash problem too. But to have him going out demanding that states gerrymander is historically unique. His extraordinary ability personally to lie about stuff and actually get away with a lot of it and have many people follow him, that's historically unique. And another thing, really the most dramatic difference, if you look at it, from the 1876 election and Donald Trump today, one of the amazing things about the 1876 election is on the night of the election, the presidential election, both candidates, Tilden and Hayes, accepted that Tilden had won. They were okay with that. There was no fight. They said, okay, here's the count, and that's game's up. And that was generally perceived to be true. And one individual, a fellow named Dan Sickles, who was, I don't know who the analogy would be, but he was a total scoundrel, kind of most famous in history, ironically, for having been acquitted by a jury. He shot and killed Francis Scott Key's son, who was having an affair with Sickles' wife. I mean, God, Sickles was a complete rogue, and it was no surprise that she was having this affair, given that he had had about 100 of them. So he finds out it's Francis Scott Keyes, goes out Jr. and kills him. He gets indicted, and he ultimately gets acquitted, and considered to be the first acquittal in America for temporary insanity. So this guy's got a history he's just off the charts. So when you look at his whole history, he's done everything. He was censured when he was in the state legislature in New York for bringing a prostitute onto the floor of the House, and a well-known prostitute, and he got censured for that. He was in Congress when he shot and killed Francis Scott Keyes Jr., and there's a whole book on the guy, and it's just like he's the number one rogue in the day. Any event, he comes by the headquarters of the Hayes campaign late at night. He wasn't really involved in the campaign, but he had actually been to the theater that night of the election. Comes by, and everybody's gone except for one clerk who's cleaning up. And he says, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, we lost." And the head of the campaign had already gone upstairs to his room in the hotel. And Sickle starts looking at the returns that have been telegraphed in from the various states. And he sees the 3 states that are still under troop control from Reconstruction are Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. So he writes a telegram to the governors in 2 states and to the head of the party in another state of the other 3, and says, "Hold your state. If you do, Hayes wins." Complete BS, because those states' returns had come in, and Hayes was not winning. Tilden was. It was very close in South Carolina. That was a close call. And Florida was a fairly close call, too. It's not a close call in Louisiana at all. But he gets telegrams back. Basically, I'm on board. And that was the beginning of it. Had it not been for that guy, the 1876 crisis would never have happened. Tilden would have been president. I bring that up because here today, compared to that, you've got the president of the United States leading the pack and is the most dangerous person in this whole political environment for the possibility of some different form of what happened in 2020 occurring in the next couple of months in 2026. So that lesson, we got to just remember this history, and we've got to remember that history can repeat itself. What do they say? It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It's not the same tone, but it rhymes. And we're hearing a lot of rhyming right now. Everything from, front-end voter suppression that Trump is trying to the other side of the deal. Count them out.
We then moved on to talk about why he felt compelled to write this book at this moment and the historical role of the Supreme Court in deciding elections.
I've thought about this, of course, a whole lot. Started writing this book. Well, it was after 2020 for sure. But before he won in 2024, and, I didn't know how that was going to come out, but I started writing it. And then, once it struck me at the election in 2024 that Republicans had a trifecta, House, Senate, and White House, then I knew we were going to have an ugly 26. And I knew the Supreme Court was going to be on the wrong side, if you will, if push comes to shove. And of course, I go into the history in the book about the Supreme Court's role in politics and the Supreme Court's role on elections specifically. I think I have a comment in there that I have 21 votes of Supreme Court justices in cases that decided presidencies either directly, like Bush v. Gore was direct, or very close to it, like in the 1876, where 5 Supreme Court justices were involved on a commission that was basically deciding that election. Congress had set them up to do it. And of the 21 Supreme Court justices who voted on who's going to be president, 19 times it's been voting with their party. The only 2 exceptions are Souter and Justice Stevens, who dissented in the Bush v. Gore case in 2020. They're the only 2 people who have ever broken with their party on a, quote, who's going to be president case. And interestingly enough, I have 4 dissents from Bush v. Gore signed by the justices hanging on my wall right here next to me, because I just think that's certainly one of the worst cases ever in the Supreme Court and one of the most historically significant. My hat's off to the dissenters. And if you read those, you can almost cry the way they describe it and say, there is no reason at all for the count to be stopped in Florida. Isn't the goal to try and find out what the right answer is? In that case, one of the most staggering things is an independent decision, a concurrence that Scalia wrote at the time. And to read that, you wonder if the guy is, are you really not hearing what you're writing? Because he actually said in that opinion that it must be stopped, so there is no cloud hanging over the presidency of George Bush. I mean, he's not even considering the fact that, well, isn't it more important that we know who won? It's a stunning thing. I mean, I can't believe his law clerk let him put that out. Because, yeah, you could say that in a, if you're in a little cocktail party with Alito and Rehnquist. Alito wasn't on there then, but with Rehnquist and so on, you could say, we got to get the job done, brother, and put Bush in office. But he writes it, and it's just astonishing to read it. So anyhow, I don't have any confidence, of course, in what this Supreme Court would do. And we have the obvious problems coming up where there is a distinct possibility that they could try and put the military at precincts. That sounds a little paranoid, but it's a good time for paranoia here. Just, as they say, just because you think they're chasing you doesn't mean you're paranoid. Sometimes they are.
I think that that's really, really well put. And I think that, unfortunately, so many of the things that people thought were hyperbolic or would never happen or were unimaginable have played out. And that doesn't mean that every worst scenario does play out, but to act as if they cannot is a fool's errand at this point.
And you have to be 100% prepared for it if it happens, and you have to be 100% engaged to try to make it not happen. Well, I think that, again, on the front end, meaning up through the actual balloting process as opposed to the back end when you're counting them, I do think that if the Democratic voting is so robust, if you will, in November, let's just say Democrats in the House had a 50-seat majority, so 25 over break even, and a lot of big gaps on that, not thin margin victories. That's the end of the game, I think. The country would not stand for the kind of finagling that Trump tried in 2020. What I worry about, and I think it's unfortunately more realistic, because with the gerrymander, you really can't predict in advance exactly how much of an advantage there is of the gerrymander, but I tell you what we can do. We can look to what was called, before now, it was called the Great Gerrymander of 2012. And after the 2010 census, it was highly gerrymandered. And in the 2012 election, Democrats got 7 million more votes than Republicans and were 33 seats short. So that's how effective the gerrymander was. And I guess when we talk about gerrymander too, you've got to add in there, we're now living with, people forget this, we're living with 20 years of accumulated voter suppression laws that have been enacted in all red states through every kind of thing, from just basically making it more difficult to vote, more difficult to register, more difficult to vote. And, a friend of mine on the state election board here made a comment that when you add any burdens, the people who are living on the margin, they're going to fall off because they're make the margin a little bit further away. They're not going to make it over it. It's just that much more difficult. So if you add that friction into the process, you're going to be losing more and more people. All the hue and cry about voter fraud and integrity, the standard justification for making things more difficult. The problem with the Republican position is there's never been a shred of evidence to support any of that stuff. Trump has famously said what to his old press representative, that I can't remember her first name now, but he said, don't worry about the truth. If you say it enough times, people will believe it. That's the standard operating. I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, Hitler certainly knew that, and Goebbels knew that. I think that's where it's first attributed to. But Trump understands that fact, and this is simple psychology, but if you can say scary things to people, it sticks in their mind. People are stealing your election. People are, vote fraud. We got to pretend, vote fraud. Well, we got to do something about that. And it's easy to get people to believe it. To have on the other side, here are the facts. And the facts show something different. It's, it's hard for people to, it doesn't get their attention to say things are safe. That's just, unfortunately, human nature, how our brains are wired, apparently. So we've got all this huge accumulation of vote suppression laws in all the Republican states. And in those Republican states, of course, we're not talking about trying to win that state for the presidency, which may be impossible in a lot of the states. But there are congressional districts in those states that should be won by Democrats, or are at least close to being won by Democrats. So the red state voter suppression is very, very significant for the upcoming November election. You add that together with gerrymandering, and let's just assume there is bringing the troops out to put them in the polling places is 100% illegal. There's a statute against it. It's explicit. When Senator Lisa Slotkin asked Hegseth at a hearing, what would you do if you were ordered to put the troops in the precincts? And he refused to answer. Well, the report I saw was Stephen Miller. That's his favorite tactic for the elections.
not necessarily to put in troops. You position ICE at the polls. When you see that, it legitimately scares people. It's an act of overt intimidation for all people of color, regardless of status.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an obvious thing, isn't it? Well, and I tell you what people don't talk about that I think maybe that's because I've, lived in the South for the last 50 years, but instead of bringing the troops out, which could be enjoined, what about putting out a call for the January 6th people to come by and have a bunch of thugs at the polling place? Obviously, in Georgia, we've got a history of that going back a long ways, 40, 50 years, but very effective. There's that famous thing, that infamous thing, really, in the Select Committee report about, when Trump put on one of his, who wasn't on, I guess he's still out on Twitter at that point, but talking, be there, it'll be wild, that famous call. And immediately thereafter, the noise on the right-wing social media stuff went up by a factor of 100. And one guy said, Daddy's calling us. We got to be there. And Daddy could do that again, in November. And the good news is, I guess, or the limit of the bad news is, I don't think those people are going to be as energized to stop congressional or Senate elections as they were for their little hero in Donald Trump. He has a unique connection with those people. And to what extent they're going to take the next step and rally up to stop congressional elections in their hometown, I don't know.
I think that that's a good point. I also think, returning to where we started in terms of the Tilden Hayes stolen presidency case, one of the things, in addition to institutions acting in ways that legitimize election, that, like the other example you gave of the bloodless coup of Bush v. Gore, one of the other factors about it was, this was a decade after the Civil War, an incredibly divided from the bottom to the top society, a society filled with hatreds and animosity, very, very deep. And I think that right now, a lot of those same, hatreds, very deep American hatreds, are very much reanimated. They're fomented and relied upon by this regime. And I think that they are routinely underestimated by the American people, that we don't want to confront, that the things that disgust us, the things that we find deplorable, the language and demonization of immigrants and Black folks and all of that, to a section of people in this country, and a not so small section, those are good things. Those are favorable things. Those are things worth fighting for. And I think that that's part of what we have to overcome. I wanted to talk to you about 2020 and the difference today. In 2020, Trump needed other people to violate or, bend their responsibilities for him, and some refused. And that's why we're in the situation we're in today, because they did refuse, right? But what changes when people who embrace the stolen election lie are placed inside the institutions that are supposed to provide those checks? Basically, what's different today? What are the guardrails that don't exist? To the degree that there were guardrails, what is gone?
It's upside down. It's radically different. Trump did try to seize the ballots in the election machinery at the end of the day. And the acting Attorney General at the time, Jeffrey Rosen, said, no, you can't do that. We don't have a search warrant. So we get a search warrant. Well, we don't have there's no facts to do it. It's illegal. And then he went to the Department of Homeland Security and lied and said, the Attorney General's telling me you're supposed to be seizing the equipment. And the guy said, what are you talking, And so it didn't go anywhere. And you may recall, too, there was, the fear, too, was him calling out the military at that time. Now, he didn't have a lackey like Hegseth, so it wasn't going to happen. But a bunch of prior secretaries of defense and so on published a public letter in the, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all over the place, just denouncing that possibility, saying it's absolutely wrong, illegal, blah, blah, blah. And so all that's changed. So how does that play out? It's playing out, as you said, in one way. He's got all the agencies behind him, all the federal agencies. Now, what happened exactly? The last-ditch effort by Trump in 2020 and 2021 was to get the Congress to take out Biden on the count him out, to use the expression from 1876. Have a hearing, because, Congress had the absolute power, really, at the end of the day, to decide on the electoral votes. And his strategy was to have the 6 swing states be reinvestigated or at least delayed, and have that going on so that the electoral vote count could be changed. And an interesting thing that didn't get a lot of attention, Sam, he didn't necessarily have to change all those states. If he could just get them where the Congress would say, we're not sure about Arizona, we're not sure about Pennsylvania, so we're not going to put any votes in anybody's category. We're not going to steal them. We're just going to move them over here, and we don't know. And what happens is, so let's say Biden ends up with more votes than Trump under that scenario. Problem is, the Constitution requires that the president get a majority of the electoral votes, and if he or she doesn't, most people don't know how the president is picked. But the president is picked by the House, the vice president is picked by the Senate, but there was a majority Democratic House at the time, but all Congress people aren't equal. Each state's delegation gets a single vote. So California would get a vote on president. Idaho would get a vote on president. All they had to do was screw up the electoral vote count a little bit, and the House gets to pick it. And even though it was a majority Democratic House, the majority of the by state was Republican. I think they had 26 out of the 50, and there was one tie. Pennsylvania, I think, was split delegation, but Republicans had 26 delegations. So that was the ultimate game, and came darn close to doing it. Often I wonder on January 6th, at the beginning of the day, had they had the vote on the electoral vote in Congress early on the 26th, before the insurrection, I don't know what the vote would have been, but he lost a lot of support. The congressmen were scared to death, and a lot of people who would have voted for him were really angry that he didn't call it off, that he permitted it, encouraged it, and didn't call it off, the invasion of the Capitol itself. He still got 127 votes to investigate Arizona when that came up. Would he gotten a majority of Congress beforehand? I don't know. But today, we've got a majority of Republicans in both sides, and we can see exactly how they vote. They go right down the line for them. What does happen then? If Democrats have a narrow victory in the House, the way that the future would be determined would be by the House itself, and the House under the Constitution, it doesn't make any difference what state courts say, or whatever Secretary of State says. Secretary of State can say Democratic congressman in this district won by 50,000 votes or 2 votes. And Congress isn't bound by that. It's not even a presumption. Congress has absolute 100% plenary authority to decide who won any congressional district. Same over in the Senate side. The Constitution explicitly has in Article 1 that the members of Congress shall be the, quote, judges of the returns and elections of their members, unquote. And that gives them plenary power to do that. The worst scenario that I see coming out of all this, and let me add one other thing to the problem here, to your point about there aren't the same people in control of the federal apparatus that there were in 2020. You've got election deniers and loyalists, and as you know, one of the requirements of getting a significant federal position was to respond to the question, who do you think won the 2020 election? And if you said Biden, you're out. You're disqualified. It's crazy. The Attorney General's got to say, oh, mister, you won it, Don. And no question about it. It was stolen from you. That's the kind of people you got there. But on the other side of the coin, too, on the state and local basis, the people who were on the election denial side in 2020, they looked at what was happening and they said, look, the state and local administrators who are handling the elections, they're ruling with the facts. They're actually reporting the truth. Most famously here in Georgia, where Trump got all over Secretary of State Raffensperger, a good, solid Republican who has supported plenty of vote suppression legislation. This boy's no pro-voter liberal by any stretch of the imagination. And Trump calls him up, literally insinuates and threatens him with the possibility of criminal prosecution if he doesn't switch the vote, come up with 11,000 non-existent votes, or Trump put him in his column. Exactly like 1876. The election deniers watched that process, and they've made a concerted effort to become players in the administrative process of states and local government. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times just yesterday about how many of such people are now in positions of authority over elections on the state and local basis. So here you go. You've got a congressional district, and the vote is really close. What happens when somebody on a county board, and they've tried to do this in Georgia, by getting people in here to do this, and the state board actually tried to pass a rule that allowed the county officials to make them independently investigated. And they wouldn't have to certify an election result if they didn't personally believe in the results after their own investigation. They couldn't accept the administrative findings that were presented to them, opening the door wide to, where the vote goes, quote, wrong. It goes where they can just not certify it. And what does that mean? You've got no official state winner for his congressional district being presented to Congress on January 3rd or January 4th, because 3rd's a Sunday. And that seat stays open. And if that happens, if the vote is close, that only has to happen in a half a dozen counties out of the 2,300 counties in the country, and stopping the count and the official victory of a handful of Democratic candidates. And you've got yourself an initial Congress who gets to be seated that is a majority Republican. And then they are 100% empowered to pass on who gets in next, on an election contest. Both candidates can file an election contest, and that is something decided by Congress, unlike Trump and other Republicans filed and lost 62 cases in state and federal court over the 2020 election, and including cases that went in front of, I don't remember how many of them were in front of Trump-appointed judges, but a good number, and a lot of them Republican judges, but a lot of them some of them were Trump appointees too, lost 62 out of 62 cases. Because in court, you've got a problem. You just can't yell, scream, and allege. You've actually got to prove what you say. And we got these things called rules of evidence. And even though Trump thinks if you see it on the internet, that makes it fact, if it supports me, that isn't the way it works in court. In a congressional election contest, fiction is just about as good as fact, if not better, if it sounds good. So an election contest in Congress, I picture that happening. And I picture the kind of histrionics and, there's a bunch of these, quote, experts that when you cross-examine them, it's a field day, but experts on that side, on the other side, who will say, oh, my God, there was 3,000 dead people voted in this election, put together based on complete nonsense. But complete nonsense, which would not be admissible in a court, is good on TV and is good enough for Congress. So that's a very dangerous thing. And when you've got Department of Justice putting up expert witness and supporting the claim of the Republican candidate in the election contest, you're adding all kinds of additional weight and credibility to that process. And again, enough to make a purely partisan decision look plausibly credible just because you've got this stuff being said. And a lot of people believe it. I'm worried about both sides. I'm worried about the ballot, but I'm more worried, from a lawyer's point of view, I'm more worried about somebody getting counted out, so to speak. It's even kind of worse in the Senate because the Senate is a continuing body. You don't start all over. Not everybody's not reelected, but just elected anew for like they are in the House. So in the Senate, on November 4th, after the election, you're going to have 2/3 of those people, well, not quite because some of them are retiring, but a quorum will be currently there, but a quorum for who will be in the Senate in 2027 will already be in the Senate. So it doesn't have this question about who's going to be newly seated. You've got people that can start doing those election contests and deciding them right away in the Senate. So on the Senate side, which of course is less likely to be a Democratic victory, but it is even more precarious, if it is a Democratic victory in terms of counting people out. I do worry about that. And had I been writing this book in 2019, I wouldn't have thought of it. I would have said, I can't put that in there. It's too crazy. But then you look at what happened in 2020, and nothing I've come up with about dangerous scenarios is I'm just reading what happened in 2020 and mapping it onto the House vote. It's different than the electoral vote. It's actually worse because if you look over at the statute for counting electoral votes, it's very specific. It's been written in the Reform Act about what you can do in terms of rejecting a state certification of a electoral vote. And it's very tight. That doesn't exist in the House. There isn't anything like that. The statute that dictates, Sam, who is on the initial roll for January 3rd, because there is nobody in the House noon on January 3rd. The old House is, bam, you've lost your authority. You have no authority. And who's going to be seated after noon on January 3rd? And the initial roll is prepared by the existing clerk, a fellow named McCumber, who's considered to be pretty fact. He was clerk under Nancy Pelosi as well. He's not considered a toady, but there is concern that he might get yanked out and replaced. But it's really not necessary for Republicans to do that because the statute, in my opinion, it says that the clerk can put on the list on the roll for the representatives elect only those people who have got credentials showing that they have been legally elected under state or federal law. And there's that extra language in there that the credentials show that. Well, I mean, I'm at least an average quality lawyer, and I can certainly make a pretty good argument that, whoa, that gives Congress the power, and that gives the clerk the power to look at this. And if there's an election contest pending, and that can be filed on November 4th, the day after the election, if there's one pending, where's the proof in the credentials that the guy actually won according to state and federal law? I worry about this too. So what if the current House had some quick election contest, which it could, and it makes a decision in, say, a half a dozen seats? But if it's really close, if they have half a dozen seats they got to change that are only separated where the candidates are separated by less than 1%, then you've got the distinct possibility of, if the House passed a resolution saying Republican X, Y, and Z won these districts in our judgment after an election contest, can the clerk really disobey that finding, that resolution by the House? I mean, the clerk is just a ministerial clerk. I don't want to denigrate clerks, but he's not like a autonomous being. He would have to say, well, I've got a different view of the law and the facts than you do, House. And that's a tough argument to make for the clerk. I mean, to me, he may resign and say, I don't buy this because I think it's BS, but I don't know if he could really deviate from a House resolution that told him what to do. It gets real ugly real fast. Then you throw in there the thing that is the wild card that we didn't have in 2020. You asked about that again. I'm circling back to the state and local problem. If all those election deniers who are now activated, organized, and often have permeated the election system, if you have them actively trying to delay, election certifications, or just trash them completely on the local and state level, it's easy to imagine another half a dozen districts not getting to the point where on January 3rd, they are credentialed, so the clerk cannot put them on that list. Again, I go back to the thing that we've literally seen attempted here in Georgia, where if you empower state election or local election officials to not certify because they have their own personal questions of the integrity of the election, or they are believing that there's fraud, or there is fraud that needs to be investigated because there's allegations of that. And these people, there's a combination of people in this too, I think, Sam. There's people who actually believe it because they've swallowed the pill. But then again, there's a lot of just liars and cheats that, know how to play the game. And that's the ones that were in the White House, in 2020. And that's the ones, I can't believe that Todd Blanche and people that really can believe this stuff, but it doesn't make any difference to them. They're going to carry the water. That I think is a real serious problem. I can see that, the 435 members of Congress, that you could have that really closely split, and that the clerk could end up listing, what's the half of that? 218, I guess, would be a majority. The clerk could list, 215 Republican winners, but leave about 10 seats vacant. That's a quorum. And the majority that then has total control on the new Congress is still Republican, even if Democrats win in the way we would use win, meaning a fair count. That is a risk that is very real. It is not being recognized like it should be. I actually did an op-ed in the Guardian a couple of months ago on this issue, but I really haven't seen other things written about it. It's disappointing, because I do believe that if it's called out in advance, loud and clear, it helps. Who in the world would have seen 2020 coming? And you're caught flat-footed. But we shouldn't be caught flat-footed this time, because we know that anything can be tried, no matter how preposterous it is and how fraudulent it is. If there's a way of sneaking around the law, and I don't think they even care about sneaking around and going right over it. It's open.
It's completely open. It's in broad daylight. It's shameless. It's overt. And I remember in 2019, when we were writing and doing podcasts and doing actions in the streets and all these sort of things, pointing to the danger of the efforts of the Trump regime to rig, to steal the election, and basically written off carte blanche as like cuckoo bananas, hysterical, every possible label that could be thrown. And in some ways, I think the situation is different today, but I think that there's still this belief that almost a religious belief, I would say, that norms will hold. And the civic religion of elections is so strong that they can't undermine it. And it's you people like me, who are sounding the alarm or who are the ones that are undermining this election. There's still that belief that sounding the alarm is somehow doing the regime's work, when I think it's very much the opposite. If people do not know the danger, they're ill-equipped to respond appropriately. And I think that we can't be so flat-footed this time in our response. And the only way to do that is the way that you have been doing, which is to walk people through. You're not prescribing what will happen. You are saying this is where the evidence points based on what the history has shown and what the regime has said, done, and said that they plan to do. And I think that really, really matters now. And, the book ends with you sharing Trump talking about Republicans controlling Congress for, I think, the next 50 years. I think he's gone further since that quote, hundreds of years, I think was his latest. When you put that alongside the history that you've documented, what do the changes that we're seeing underway, especially the voter suppression efforts, what do they mean for the longer term ability of voters to remove those in power through elections? And what does defending that ability require, not just through the ballot, but through the efforts to defend people's rights to vote?
Right. Well, I think two things. And I think the real exact ending of that book, quote those words from the judge up in Massachusetts. And he was dealing with the First Amendment case of people being arrested and being deported and so on because of protesting on behalf of Palestinian issues. He's a Reagan-appointed judge, very conservative guy, but he actually believes in the Constitution. And he is so disgusted with the administration's absolute disregard for the First Amendment. And he goes through that. It's a 93-page opinion. He goes through the whole thing, and Rubio and everybody is just getting on people because of their beliefs, period. So he ends it up with a remarkable discussion. I've never seen anything like this in any judge before. But he goes into the questions. Well, the question now is, what should I do? What relief would be appropriate? He goes through, I have no confidence that the Department of Justice would follow any order I would issue. And he goes through this analysis and he quotes the old thing that, is actually a piece of wisdom, it turns out, from Ronald Reagan, possibly there's only one. And he says, we must be very careful to protect our freedoms because freedom is given to a generation only once. And if you lose it, getting it back is extraordinarily difficult, much more difficult than losing it. He then goes on and says, I worry that the American people aren't going to rise up to protect those rights, which they need to do, or they will be lost. And then he says the old point that if it hasn't directly, personally affected them, I worry they won't do anything about it, and they'll be lost. And that's how he ends it. I think he's right, that two things. I think people must stand up, speak out, and get involved. And the only way that can happen on the scale that needs to happen, to answer your question, Sam, how do we protect this in the future, is education and getting the message out to people as effectively and broadly as can possibly be done. And that's a very difficult thing, in the modern world. It's theoretically made easier in the sense of all the ways we can communicate with people electronically through the internet and so on. But of course, it's more difficult, too, because the level of communication is so truncated, if you will, on the internet. It's not like, you go back before electronic media, way back. Clarence Darrow was famous for, they would have the town's entertainment back in those days. They'd have speakers come to the town hall or local church and have a debate. And people come to be entertained by that and educated by it. So you'd have Clarence Darrow on one side of the issue and you have somebody else, and there'd be a really interesting debate about whatever it was they were talking about. Might have been slavery and so on back in those days, or whatever. It would have been in those days for Clarence Darrow. But the depth of the communication and so on that was part of those discussions, we are so into quick, superficial communication that it's very difficult to pierce through people's preconceptions and beliefs they already have. But we have to do it. The book I did before this is named Whose Choice Is It? I didn't write but a bit of that. Most of it's contributing authors. It's an anthology. But one of the chapters is an interview. I went over to Amsterdam, did an interview with Rebecca Gompertz, a doctor there. who is an extraordinary person and really one of the most interesting people I've ever met. And she's a real leader in the world of women's rights on access to abortion care specifically. That chapter is a great read. But she said when we were having dinner before that what really bothers her is she goes to these conferences around the world about women's rights and abortion. And it's the same people always talking to each other. They already believe all these things, and they're just talking to each other. It's not having any effect at all. It's not moving the needle. It's not developing support for the issues. And I remember she gave me this example. She said, every time I'm in a taxi cab, I will figure out a way of bringing up the subject of abortion with the driver. She might do something like, gee, I saw something in the paper the other day. Just one of those little, she doesn't start hectoring the person or lecturing them. She does like I might if I was trying a jury case, I might start talking to the jury and say something about, my 8-year-old son last night asked me a question. He says, Dad, what's your case about? People listen then. If I start lecturing to them, they ain't going to listen. But if I start putting it into a human context, they're going to start hearing it a different way. We have to effectively communicate the truth. You can have different values about stuff. I don't have a problem with that. But if you're living in a fictional world about the facts, then we got a real problem. And that's where we are right today. People have to understand the truth about the facts. You can have your values, whatever they may be, but you cannot deny and you cannot live in a fictional world. We've got to get out of that. And we're going down that rabbit hole pretty far. But there needs to be effective ways of communicating beyond ourselves and beyond people who, are already functioning based on facts. Then I certainly know Republican governors and so on that have been down here that they do. I mean, it's not like every Republican, of course, is living in the world of fiction. But, these people that are the election deniers and so on, and people don't understand things like all the voter suppression laws and voter ID and why those are being passed and what the real significance of those is and how something that sounds innocuous to somebody that's reasonably affluent or middle class, it sounds, well, that's reasonable. They don't understand that somebody that's on the edge and living on the margin, how that's going to push them over. We've got to care about those people. If we don't, that's a real measure of society. If we don't give a damn about our brothers and sisters, no matter what their educational, economic status is, we're a failed society. But to me, to your question, how do we protect these rights going forward? It's a massive challenge of education, and it's how you speak and communicate with people, too. We can't call them idiots. We can't say, you've swallowed the blue pill, whatever color that pill was, and it's got to be done in a very respectful way. That's, to me, how you, I don't know if you call it a political movement or whatever, but just a social communication and an effort to get people sensitized to the importance of it. And at the end of the day, it's their rights. It's the old story, like, they came to me and they arrested the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't worry about it. Then they arrested socialists, and I wasn't a socialist. And then they were arresting the Jews, and I wasn't Jewish. And then they came for me, and there was no one left. That type of problem, people, I worry that if people aren't personally affected, they're not going to stand up and protect these rights. And that's a real challenge. We do have too many self-satisfied consumers, I guess, that really don't care about things that aren't affecting them.
I think that is extremely true that we're seeing. The level of, what I consider to be parasitic individualism is really, really, really detrimental. And the Niemöller quote that you pointed out is one that I think needs to be on many people's minds. And there's a less known Niemöller quote that I'm going to butcher, so I'm not going to directly quote it. But Pastor Niemöller, when I think he was interviewed, I don't think it was in writing, I think he was spoken to, he said that basically, had they acted sooner, had they acted in the way that was needed, people would have lost their lives. There would have been people that would have died, but there would be profoundly more that would have been saved. I'm not here advocating for people to lose their lives here. I want to be clear. But the lesson being that we are already way too far down that Niemöller quote if you just replace a few of those words, and not many of them. And there is a question of what will we accept? Yes, but also who will we become? as individual people, yes, but also as a society, what we will allow us to be transformed into. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise, your insights around this topic. And most importantly, of course, thank you for writing Stealing Elections, American Style. And we are going to link the book, which you can pre-order, in the show notes, and people should get it. People should discuss it. In my opinion, make it a book club. Make that part of how you're educating each other, and expanding the circles of who knows about this. David, is there anything else that you want people to know? Any other resources that we should link to of yours? I mean, we'll link to your Guardian article as well and your website. Is there anything else that you want to share with people?
No, I think I would just point out too, there's a lot of information in the book, but it's a fun read. It's not a dry, dense legal or historical tome. Like you point out the first chapter on the Tilden Hayes thing. I mean, it's a engaging story, and all these stories are
It's a drama.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Lyndon Johnson Steele in 48, it's a drama, and there's a whole bunch of chapters like that that illustrate and develop a point. The historical stuff is trying to make that as interesting as possible as well. It's hard for me to imagine anybody that could read that and not learn something out of that. It's just, no matter how well you know history, there's going to be new things in there that are going to be very interesting to people. So that's a fun read. So I would second your motion in that regard. And I think it is a good start to the whole thing. It's got a lot of the details and the facts about voter suppression, modern day. I think I've got a chapter in there called 2 Centuries of Voter Suppression. And then another chapter is voter suppression in the 21st century and all that's going on in the last 25 years. There's a lot of things there that when people hear these, what sound like reasonable propositions, like checking people for citizenship status, it's a good discussion there about what that's really about and what that means. And I guess for example, if you had documented proof of citizenship requirement, you might knock out 5 people in the United States who are non-citizens who would have voted, but you can knock out about 50,000 citizens who have the right to vote in doing it. So that's the purpose of those requirements, to knock those people out, because it's going to be tended to be more democratic, and that's the purpose of it. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I thank you, Samantha, for doing what you do, and thank you for having me here. It's been enjoyable.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. If you value this show, help us expand its reach. Become a patron, become a paid subscriber on Substack, or pick up merch to support the movement. Links to do those things are in the show notes. And as always, you can find more at refusefascism.org. There are important ways to help that cost nothing. Share this episode with friends and family. Rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Subscribe to our Substack for free and recommend it to others. Stay connected and get involved at refusefascism.org. Follow us on social media at refusefascism. You can also text REFUSE to 855-755-1314 to join in. As always, much appreciation to Richard Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. Until next time, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.